Welcome, everyone. We'll just let the folks roll in here, and then we'll get started here in just a minute. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jeremy Rogers, the Director of Legal Affairs here at Oregon Realtors, and today we are going to be spending an hour discussing our real estate purchase and sale agreement, residential purchase and sale agreement for the Oregon Realtors Forums Library. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you could direct your questions to the Q&A rather than the chat, that's helpful in keeping them organized, and we can identify once we've answered them. So feel free to put comments in the chat, but if you're going to ask a question that you want answered, if you could put that in the Q&A rather than the chat, that would be super helpful. And then today, I'm going to just give you a quick overview of some of the resources available to you from our website, and then we're going to jump in and walk through the residential purchase and sale agreement. And feel free to ask any questions that you have. We'll make sure that they get answered. And we hope that you walk away today with a deep understanding of the residential purchase and sale agreement, an understanding of why we made some of the choices that we made in drafting the agreement the way that we did, and that you also know where you can find additional resources to help you as you are learning these forms. So let's go ahead and get started. So the Oregon Realtors Forums website is orforums.org. If you haven't already bookmarked that, you should do so. It's a great resource for you. It is your hub for information on the forums. And I want to just point out a few things to you as you're getting started. First, if you need any help accessing the forums, click this Forums tab here. Okay, that's going to tell you how to access the forms on .loop, SkySlope, and Zip. Hopefully by now, all of you had a chance to do that. We do have some explainers down here how to get your forms in case you do have questions. And then, of course, if you're having any technical difficulties with those programs, you should reach out directly to the vendors. What I really want to show you, though, before we look at the sale agreement, is the training tab. Okay, if you haven't had time to spend on this yet, please do, because in addition to these live trainings that we're doing every Friday, we have a tremendous level of training opportunities available to you to really develop a mastery in these forms. So right here, you'll see a series of green buttons that show all of the different training opportunities we have. So if you've not taken it yet, we have a self-paced 2-hour course training called Using Oregon Realtors Forms. Okay, and that is the baseline training for our forms, where rather than just having someone walk through it like I'm going to do today in a presentation, you're actually working through some scenarios that you're likely to face in your actual transactions. And that course is taught by a principal broker rather than by an attorney like myself. So it's going to have some more practical elements for you. And we've designed that curriculum intentionally with the goal of helping you learn the various aspects of the form in context. So encourage you to take that if you haven't yet. You'll also see we have another one here on terminations, and we will continue to populate this catalog. We actually have several other of these self-paced trainings that are available through online ed. I think they're just not posted here yet. But if you go to the main page of our education and training for online ed, you'll see those available. We also have live trainings. That's what you're doing today, but if you aren't aware, you can see a calendar of all the live trainings if you click that green button I just clicked. Okay, so you can see all the upcoming instances of trainings. Next week, we're doing one on commercial. We're going to do one on our ag sale agreement, on our vacant land sale agreement, on our manufactured home sale agreement, and others. So take a look at that and make sure you sign up for those trainings. We do have our virtual open house after we finish here today. If you want to, you can pop over to our virtual open house. It occurs at 11 a.m. every Friday. You can come every week. You can come 1 week, whatever you want to do. And that's an opportunity for you to ask questions of myself and our staff attorney, Nicholas Peasley. We were the primary attorneys that worked on the forms along with a committee of principal brokers. But we're there for you, so you can just fire away any questions that you have and make sure that you get those answered, and know that on a weekly basis, we'll be available to you. Okay. We also have recorded tutorials. These are not going to be for CE credit, but they are videos that are available to help coach you on different aspects of the forms. Take a look at that library. We've got a lot in there. We've got a video on sort of navigating the two forms environment and the best strategies for that with the OREF forms and the Oregon Realtors forms. Repairs, just a brief overview of our purchase and sale agreement, a brief overview of our overall document library. We have lead-based hazards, and we have a presentation on the differences between the OREF forms and the Oregon Realtors forms. I mentioned some of these longer ones are actually are available for CE credit. They're just not posted there on the website yet. So, and Katie, maybe you could post the link to where folks can find those, because I know I did see them available on Online Ed. All right, so those are some of the trainings. And then additionally, I want to make sure you're aware of this. We have what we call the guided forms library. So if you scroll down on this training page and you see the list of forms here, if there is a green button that says guided form with videos, that means we have an annotated version of that form. Okay, I'm going to pull that up so you can see what it looks like. It's training only copy, okay, but it has these little play button icons next to each section of the agreement. So if you click that play button icon, a video is going to pop up and you're going to get an explanation of that section of the sale agreement, okay? So I'm going to walk through the sale agreement today, but no, you can always go back to this guided form and get a video for each section of this sale agreement and the others explaining that. Now, we don't have all of them up yet, only the ones with the green buttons, but we're working on that, and we'll soon have those guided forms up for all of our forms, okay? So I hope that that is a great resource for you. So let's move on and start looking at the sale agreement, okay? And I'm going to grab the sale agreement so you all can access these in your platforms, .loop, SkySlope, Zip, okay? But we also have them available here as PDFs, not for use in your transactions, but just to review. That's what I'll use today when we're going through the form. This will take you to a Dropbox folder. It has all of our documents, okay? I want to point out document 0 is our document numbering list. This is going to show you all of the forms that we have available. Today, we're just going to focus on the residential purchase and sale agreement, but spend some time learning this document so you're aware of all of the sale agreements, as well as all of the addenda to the sale agreement that we have in our library. So let's go ahead and pull up the residential sale agreement and get started on that. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of the agreement, sort of how we've structured it, very high level, and then I'm going to go back and go section by section and explain to you what that section's about, how you're supposed to use it, and why we made the choices that we did related to that portion of the document. So here's our residential sale agreement, and the first thing I want you to know is that you can really think about this I'd say, think about it in 4 parts, okay? The first part is the final agency acknowledgement. That's the first thing that you're going to see when you open up our sale agreement. The big difference between what you're used to seeing and what we've provided here is that we've used a full page for our final agency acknowledgement, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about why we did that. Okay, we've also separately numbered it here, page 1 of 1, because we used the full page. We were able to do that and then just begin the actual content of our sale agreement again on page 1 of the actual residential sale agreement, and it is a 10-page document, okay? So when you're looking at this actual sale agreement, there are really 3 parts to it. The first part are the specific terms, the unique terms to this transaction. Those terms are all covered on the first page and a quarter of the document, okay? So you'll see a lot of fillable space, a lot of check boxes. This is where you're going to be outlining the details that are unique to this particular property, to the parties and the transaction, okay? We do have an additional provision section there as well. The second section of the sale agreement, and I'm going to come back and go through each section in detail. The second section are the time period terms. These are the terms that have a date or a deadline associated with them, and in many cases where you will be selecting either between a pre-printed number of days. For example, here for the earnest money deposit, 3 business days is the pre-printed number, or you could check the other box and write in a different number of days. Okay, so that is what this time period section is all about. Those provisions are all clustered together here. Then when you get to page 4 of the sale agreement, okay, or actually we're on page 5, then we're through with the time period terms. Okay, and we are on to the general terms. The general terms, there are no places for you to make amendments to the contract. There are no checkboxes for you to select. There are no blank lines for you to fill in. These are very important terms, but they're terms that really should not be modified in the contract. Now, there may be a couple exceptions to that. For example, in this general term section, we have a section related to the allocation of closing costs between the two parties. We have a section related to the allocation of rents and deposits and utilities between the parties. Perhaps you're going to use an addendum to modify those provisions if what we've written here does not fit the needs of your client. But for the most part, you're not going to want to change any of these terms because they're describing the basic sort of legal underpinnings of the contract, and you don't really want to be stepping into that, crossing that line in modifying those. And that's why we haven't created the space for you to modify them. Okay, so the general terms are the remaining 5 pages of this document, and we'll go through all of those. And then when you get to the end on page 10, there is additional place to fill in, of course, because the buyer is going to include an offer deadline, and the buyer is going to sign and date. The seller is going to accept, reject, or counter, sign and date as well. And the agent can indicate here that they have presented the offer to their client and the time that they did the presentation. Okay, so that is the overall structure. Now I'm going to go back and go through this in detail. And Katie, if you could just let me know as we're going, if you're seeing things pop up in the Q&A, and I will pause to handle those. I'm not seeing anything yet. So thank you. So the final agency acknowledgement, why did we make it a whole page? Well, we wanted to give you more space to disclose agency relationships. Oregon statute, Oregon regulation requires that all existing agency relationships be disclosed on a final agency acknowledgement attached with the purchase and sale agreement. Oftentimes, people are working in teams where there are multiple licensed real estate agents that are servicing a client. In that case, our interpretation of the statute and regulation is that you should be disclosing that. So we wanted to give you the space to do that. So we have put 3 buyer's agent and 3 seller's agent lines. Okay. Also, there could be a co-listing. Maybe there are 2 selling agents, or 2 listing agents working together as a co-listing. Opportunity now to disclose that without having to use an addendum to do so. If you don't have more than 1 agent representing one side, that's okay. You can just leave the other spaces blank, but we've provided that space for you in case that you need it. Okay. The other thing we did here is we added this language here, at first contact. Okay, why? Because Oregon law requires that you provide the initial agency disclosure pamphlet at first contact with your client. Okay, and the purpose of this document is to acknowledge that the agency relationships exist, and the client is acknowledging that they have received that document at first contact. Okay, so this is we find this is going to be helpful to you because now you're going to have this written acknowledgement from your client that they in fact did receive that from you at first contact, as you're required to provide by Oregon law. Okay. The other thing you'll note, and this is not just the final agency acknowledgement, it's all of our documents. Okay. We have 4 buyer and 4 seller signature lines. Okay, so if you do have more than 2, which often is the case, more than 2 buyers or 2 sellers, now you can handle that on this document without having to bring in an addendum to do that. Of course, if you have more than 4, you're going to need to bring in an addendum. Now, if you need an additional final agency acknowledgement for some reason, because perhaps you have more than 3 seller agents or more than 3 buyer agent relationships to disclose, Form 9.1 in our library is another copy of the final agency acknowledgement, and you can use that document. Okay, now let's take a look at the actual purchase and sale agreement. Now we've moved on from the final agency acknowledgement. The first item in the specific terms is this opening section. And what we're trying to do here is inform the parties that this is a binding contract. They need to understand that, okay? They're going to be bound by the obligations here. If they don't understand what those obligations are, okay, or they're unsure about the financial implications of those obligations, they need to consult with their own competent legal and financial advisors, okay? The other thing is that buyers and sellers are acknowledging here that they have read and that they understand the Oregon Realtors buyer and seller advisories. We have document called the buyer advisory, called the seller advisory. Those documents are in our library as forms 10.1 and forms 10.2, okay? And we have packaged the advisories for buyer and packaged the advisories for seller so that they are on notice of all the things that they need to know when they enter not even just the contract, but their journey to buy a home and to sell a home, okay? So what you really need to do is provide those buyer and seller advisories to your client. We recommend when you establish the relationship with them, because a lot of information in there is going to help them navigate this transaction even before there is a signed purchase and sale agreement. The buyer advisory helps the buyer understand why they need to get inspections, what type of inspections they might want to get, help them understand things like radon and oil tanks and other things they may not be familiar with. It's really important as a risk management tool for you and for your client to use those, and that's why we've built them in and are requiring that they be used. I want you all to know that if we've heard some feedback on our advisories that they're too long, or that the asking the buyer and seller to initial each page as they are set up in Zip and SkySlope and Dotloop is too onerous, okay? Now, having the seller and buyer initial each page is a good risk management tool, and that is why we set them up inside Zip and SkySlope that way. However, we do have another version of them where the text is a bit smaller and there are not initials on every page that are available on our website, okay? So if you believe that the ones that are in your SkySlope or Zip are too onerous, you could use the ones from our website. But again, as a risk management tool, we think it's helpful to both have large type so that people can read it, and also have the initials so that there is evidence that the buyer and seller have actually read each page, okay? Now, the next portion of our document here, you're just identifying the parties, okay? We often will get questions about, okay, well, what do I do if it's a trust? Okay, well, if it's a trust, the buyer is going to be the trustee for the trust. Okay, so the right way to do this is if it's Jeremy Rogers as trustee for the Jeremy Rogers Revocable Living Trust, that's who the buyer is. Okay, that's the right way to fill out the name of a buyer for a trust. All right, property description. That is the next section here. I want to let you know how we've laid this out, how it's different, and why. Okay, we've separated property address as a specific field. That field will auto-populate from the MLS. We also have the county field. Hopefully that field is also populating from the MLS, okay? We have separate lines then for additional property description, okay? That field is not going to auto-populate from the MLS. And the reason why is because sometimes if you're pulling like a tax account number, for example, sometimes what's described in that tax account could be over-inclusive or under-inclusive of the actual amount of property being sold. It actually requires human intelligence application of reading it and understanding exactly what's being sold, because maybe there's two adjacent lots, only one lot's being sold. Maybe there's been a recent lot division and that hasn't been accounted for yet in the records. So if you have a legal description that's efficient, we encourage you to put that there, okay? I mean, the best thing you always can have is a legal description. However, sometimes you have a long meets and bounds description, and that might not fit here, okay? Or you might not be comfortable with writing that in. And so the property address might be the best thing for this sale agreement. And then later on in the document, we have a section that says that if a legal description is not provided here, then the parties are going to review and they're going to confirm the property description, that legal description that is provided by the title company, and that will serve as the legal description for the purposes of the transaction, okay? Now, ORF has a similar provision saying if a legal description is not attached, the one that's provided by escrow will be used as the description for the transaction. All right, Q&A. Are we able to pull the MLS information on these forms through different platforms? Yes, so right now, MLS Connect is set up with the various platforms. The level of information that might pull over might vary depending on platform, but MLS Connect is activated so that if you're using one of the platforms, it should be, the fields that are programmed to auto-populate should be auto-populating from them. What I was mentioning here is that we have told Zip and SkySlope not to auto-populate this additional property description field because we want there to be some application of human intelligence to make sure that if something's going to be put in that field, that it actually is describing the amount of property being sold. All right, financial terms is the next section here. We wanted to consolidate this, line it all up on the right-hand side, make it easy to evaluate the financial terms of this offer. So we've got purchase price, the earnest money amount, also where the earnest money is going to be held. Hopefully you guys are using escrow companies for that. Of course, you can use a client trust account by law. It's riskier to do so. There's a lot of compliance if you do. So we encourage you to use escrow, but we do have a space to indicate if it is going to be held in a client trust account. Remainder of the down payment, okay, so you're going to deduct the amount of earnest money and then the remainder of the down payment, okay, that is set to auto-populate, at least in zip forms and SkySlope. Remainder of purchase price, okay, to be paid at closing, and whether that's going to be cash, loan, or seller financed. Buyer's closing costs and prepaid items. What we want here is the amount, okay, not the details of what they are, but the amount. How much of the closing costs or prepaids is seller going to pay on behalf of buyer? That's what you'd put in there. If it's nothing, then you can put 0 or leave it blank, whatever your practice is. But that's the amount, not the detail of what it is. Okay. Then on line 4F, if any amounts above are based on contingent funds or non-liquid funds, you need to specify that here. Contingent and non-liquid funds are defined in our definitions, but the basic idea is if that cash isn't readily available, okay, then you should be disclosing that here. If someone is expecting a gift, if they have to liquidate a 401k account or a cryptocurrency account, you should indicate that here. That's a material piece of information that the seller needs to know in evaluating the quality of the offer, because it's going to be a lesser quality offer if one of them has the same purchase price, but does not depend on any contingent funds versus one that does. Okay, I see some questions here. Are you able to fill all of this on a seller or buyer line? John Smith, trustee. Yeah, so we've tried really hard to work with the vendors to make sure there's enough space to write it in. There could be situations where you have an extremely long trust name and you would have to use an addendum to describe it because it doesn't fit. There's nothing we can do about that. We've provided as much space as we can, and we've worked with the vendors to use the best sort of technology functions to like shrink the text as you write more of it to try to fit as much in as you can. But there could be situations where it's just extremely long trust name, and that's just is what it is. You need to use an addendum. Who makes the decision to use escrow, client trust account, brokerage, client? Almost everybody uses escrow. I mean, ultimately, it's always going to be a client decision, but a lot of times the broker doesn't even have a client trust account set up, and the standard of practice is to use escrow. It's pretty rare to use a client trust account as a risk management practice. I'm not really sure why, unless in extraordinary circumstances, anybody would be using a client trust account. So I would say you should always be defaulting to escrow, but obviously it's your client's money and they get to decide where they want to put it. But it's not the kind of thing that most people say, hey, do you want me to use a client trust account or escrow? I think it's usually presumed that escrow is the default, okay? And that I think is the best way to go. All right, back to the party's names. When the property is in a trust and the name of the trust is really long, it doesn't fit the name field, what's the best phrase for now? Yeah, I would say that you're just gonna have to use an addendum for that, okay? So you could say see addendum 1, and it says buyer, say see addendum 1, and addendum 1 has got the full name, okay? That's one way to do it, but you'd have to use some form of an addendum. All right, okay, so we just went through the financial terms section. Is it legal to disclose in the listing remarks which set of forms your client would like to use? So we have a separate video that I mentioned on sort of how to navigate the 2-form environment. So I won't spend a lot of time on it here. So feel free to go look at that. But our answer would be, it would be okay to express a preference, okay, but not a command. Okay. And at the end of the day, you're obligated to present offers to your client, regardless of which form they come in on. And you should talk with your client. I mean, if you're expressing a preference, that should be coming from your client. But it's generally speaking that your client's going to want to get the deal done, whichever form it comes in on. And so you could express a preference, but you shouldn't be like discriminating against that offer if it comes in. Whichever offers the best offer should be the one that your client accepts. All right. Okay, so then loan program. So here you're going to indicate what type of loan program. I want to point out something to you here. We have little parenthetical references, okay, like form 2.19. What does that mean? That means that when you see that reference, you need to use that form to accomplish that aspect of the transaction. Here, we have a form that deals with the FHA and VA amendatory clauses that are required under federal law. So if you're going to check FHA or VA loan, you would check that box, and that you would use that form. If you're using zip forms, When you check that box, Form 2.19 should automatically populate into your file. Okay, you're still going to have to, fill it out, but it will come into your file. Okay, the other vendors, that's not the case as far as we know, but with Zip Forms, that is the case. Okay, lots of options for what type of loan. We have a big space for other that you can specify as well. Okay, buyer is pre-approved. If the buyer is pre-approved, check yes, attach it if it's available. If not, later in the document, we have a deadline for submitting pre-approval. The pre-printed number of days on that is 2 business days. I'll get to those Q&As here in just a minute. I want to just roll through some of this. Conveyance. What I'll probably do here is roll through this specific term section, and then I'll pick up the Q&A just to make sure we get through everything. So conveyance, there's an Oregon regulation. It says every offer has to state whether the transaction will be accomplished by way of deed or a land sale contract. So that's what we accomplish here. Deed is going to be the case most of the time. Okay, a normal transaction is going to be done by way of deed. However, if it's a seller carried transaction, then 2 things are true. 1, you need to use our Form 8.1, which is our seller carried addendum. And 2, then you're going to have to indicate whether the transaction is going to be accomplished by way of a promissory note and deed of trust or a land sale contract. Okay. And we make this clear in our seller carried addendum, that choice between a promissory note, deed of trust, or a land sale contract for a seller carried transaction, that's a choice that your client needs to make with your client's own legal and financial experts. Okay, that's not a choice that you should be making for them or advising them on, but it's a material term of this transaction, and it is required by Oregon regulation to state if something's going to be done by a land sale contract or deed, and that is why we have it here on the first page. Okay, the next section is related to closing. You're going to put a date, and you're going to put a possession date if it's different than closing. Now, if possession date is different than closing, that means there has to be some contractual agreement about what happens in the in-between time. We have 2 documents, a seller's agreement to occupy after closing. Okay, we call it, I believe, the seller occupancy agreement, and the buyer's agreement to occupy before closing. We call that the buyer pre-closing occupancy agreement. Those are forms 2.16 and 2.17 respectively. Okay, so you would need to use one of those if your possession date is going to be different than your closing date. Okay, because there's got to be something governing what happens during that period of time. We have a space here to indicate whether prorations will occur, taxes, utilities, rents, deposits, stuff will occur as of closing, possession, or some other date. It indicate the title and escrow agent here. The company by law is actually the agent. The officer is the human being who works for that company that you're working with. So you can disclose both of those items here. We thought it would be create more efficiency to know who the officer is as well. It's a real estate contract, meaning that all personal property is going to be excluded from the sale and all fixtures will be included in the sale unless the parties agree in writing that they want something other than that. There's space here to write if you want something other than that. If you want certain personal property items to be included or certain fixtures to be excluded, that is what you would put here. Anytime that you're using at least SkySlope or Zip Forms and you have a multi-line field like this and you use up all of the space in your multi-line field, those programs are programmed to automatically allow you to keep typing, and it will populate our Form 2.2 general blank addendum, and we'll bring that blank addendum into the file, okay? So that's a feature that we have with Zip and SkySlope. So if you run out of space, keep writing, and it should auto-populate onto a blank addendum, and then bring that into the file, okay? So hopefully that's helpful to you. The next item is around construction. So we do not have a new construction sale agreement in the Oregon Realtors Forms library. We just have the residential sale agreement and an addendum that you use for new construction. It's called Form 4.1, New Construction Addendum. Here we tell you that you're supposed to use that document either with new construction or if there's more than $50,000 in remodeling within 90 days of closing. The reason for that, and keep in mind, this is within 90 days of closing, okay? Not within 90 days of when you made the offer, 90 days of closing. So if the remodeling was done 45 days ago and it was completed then, but you're closing 60 days out, that's 105 days. That's not 95 days of closing. The reason we have this is that sellers are required under Oregon law to protect buyers from construction liens if there's been more than $50,000 in remodeling within 90 days of closing. Also, oftentimes, if there's been more than $50,000 in remodeling within 90 days of closing, you might be dealing with a flipped home. And that flipped home, really, there should be more disclosure given to the buyer about whether that flipper was a licensed contractor, which, by the way, if they're flipping homes as a business, they should be registered as a licensed contractor or developer. And by being registered as a licensed contractor or developer, the buyer is going to have more remedies against them that they can pursue with the Construction Contractors Board if they did faulty construction. So we wanted to make sure that buyers were protected as they're required under Oregon law with the Homebuyer Protection Act, that the seller has to protect against liens, but also that buyers got the other additional disclosures and protections that are included in our new construction document if there's that level of remodeling. So that's why we did that. We recognize you may not know exactly when you make the offer how much remodeling was done. What I would say is pick up the phone and call. If it looks like a house that's been substantially remodeled, pick up the phone and call. If you're on the listing side, start including that information in the private remarks so that the buyer knows. Moving forward, maybe we'll get the MLSs to add a checkbox on that so it's even easier, okay? You're gonna have to do some conversation to figure it out. If you learn it later in the transaction, no big deal. Bring in the new construction addendum at that time, okay? But we want people to be protected. That's why we're requiring that. The next item is around tenants. Whether tenants are in the property is a material term. That's why it's here on the first page. The answer is either yes or no, but the issue then is gonna be either the seller is going to be terminating that tenancy because the buyer is moving in as a primary resident, or the seller is not going to be terminating the tenancy because the buyer is taking it on as an investment property. We have an addendum for both of those scenarios. 7.1 is the addendum you use when a buyer is going to be occupying as a primary resident and the seller is going to be terminating the tenancy. That document is going to deal with all of the issues around the termination of the tenancy and create some protections for buyer to ensure that the termination of the tenancy is done properly. So use that form if that's the situation. On the other hand, use form 4.2 if it's an investment property and the buyer is taking on the tenant. The next item is around associations. We do not have a condo townhome sale agreement in the Oregon Realtors Forms library. We have an association addendum that you'd use with the residential purchase and sale agreement anytime that there is a homeowners association, including a condominium, okay? So if the answer is yes, there is an association, then you check yes and you use form 4.4. Form 4.4 deals with all the HOA documents, creating a contingency for the buyer to review those documents, provide some disclosure, important advisory information to the buyer, and also has detailed information related to parking spaces and storage units and other items that may either be part of the sale or might be rented at that condo, okay? I see some Q&As. I'll pop those up after we get through this initial section. Purchase and sale contingencies. As you all know, sometimes a deal is contingent upon a buyer selling their existing property or a seller finding a replacement property. We have a form for both of those situations. Okay, 2.10 if it's the buyer who's creating the contingency, form 2.12 if it's the seller. If that's part of this transaction, indicate that here and use that form. Water sewer connections, indicate what they are, check the box and use the appropriate addendum. 2.8 if there's a well, 2.9 if there's an on-site sewage addendum or on-site sewage system, both if there is both. Lead hazards, if the home was built before, if construction commenced before January 1st, 1978, okay, then you want to use this addendum. You check yes, you use our lead-based lead hazard addendum. Now, keep in mind, you may not know exactly when construction commenced. So I would say if the home was completed at any time in the vicinity of 1978, use the lead-based paint documents to make sure that your seller, that the parties, and particularly the seller, who's the one obligated to provide the documents, is complying with federal law. Okay, so if it was completed in 1979, you don't know when it was started, well, you might want to just use the documents just in case. Okay, wood stove insert. If the property has a wood stove or a wood stove insert, use the form, check yes, use the form. Okay, it's 2.13. It's similar to what you're used to. We've also added a piece to that document where the parties can indicate if the wood stove is going to be removed by the seller, who's responsible for any damage to the surface of the property that results from removal, because there might be a hole in the ceiling. So that's an addition we've made to our addendum. If there's going to be any equipment like solar panels or an alarm system, either financed or leased, that may be coming with the property, then you're going to use form 7.3 to address those issues. Okay. Historic property, if it applies, use form 4.3. If there's any other special tax assessment other than historic property, okay, these are going to be your farm, forest land, habitat, conservation easement type of stuff, open space. Use form 4.3. It'll allow the seller to detail what those special assessments are and give the buyer some protections to ensure that the seller doesn't jeopardize those special tax assessments during the pendency of the transaction. Okay, that's form 2.22. I'm sorry. Home warranty, you can put the details here. Okay, FERPTA. If the seller is a foreign person under FERPTA, then we say use our FERPTA addendum. If the seller, it's 2.7. If the seller is not a foreign person under FERPTA, you don't have to use that addendum. You can use the addendum if you want. It's a good document. It goes into more detail than the sale agreement, but the sale agreement itself has a section on FERPTA, and that should be sufficient to instruct the parties what to do in the case that the seller is not a foreign person under FERPTA. Okay, and then there's additional provisions here. As I mentioned, if you run out of space typing additional provisions, if you're using Zip or SkySlope, that should auto-populate onto a blank addendum to allow you to keep typing and add additional information on that blank addendum. All right, now I'll take questions on this specific term section. Okay, is it legal to disclose in the listing marks which set of clients? Oh, I already dealt with that. Yeah, as a preference, but not as a requirement. Okay, line 39, is it 50K for a single project or total amount? If 50K in remodeling has been done within 90 days of closing, whether it's one project or two, that would apply. You'd use our form 4.1. Okay, it's not per project. Is holdback for repairs over 50,000 considered remodeling? If the repairs have not been done, and so you're holding back for those repairs to be done after closing, then that wouldn't count. Here you're talking about repairs that the seller has initiated and the seller had hired the contractors, because that's the case where the buyer is going to need to be protected against liens that resulted from the seller's actions. Okay, so it's about if the seller is going to be doing the repairs within 90 days of closing or hiring a contractor to do the repairs, that's when you need to use it, not if they happen after closing. All right, so that is the specific terms. The next section of our document are the time period terms. Let me point out a few things to you here. One, any period counted in either business days or calendar days commences on the business day or calendar day, the next business day or calendar day. Okay, so that's the same as the OREF agreement. Okay, if you sign something on a Monday, the first day for counting period is going to be the Tuesday. Okay, so that should be similar to what you're used to. We say that the triggering event is mutual acceptance. Okay, so if there's a timeline, it's going to be based on mutual acceptance unless otherwise it says something else. Oftentimes it'll say after somebody delivers a notice. Okay, that's a very common trigger for a timeline. Okay, so it's either going to be printed in the document here what the trigger is. If it's not printed, then the trigger is mutual acceptance of the sale agreement. Okay, and then business days, that deadline is going to be reached at 5 p.m. if it's a business day deadline. If it's a calendar day deadline, 11:59. Now, for a residential sale agreement, almost everything is business days. Okay, the only thing you're going to see calendar days in this document are the lead-based paint related documents, because it's federal law that lays out calendar days. Everybody, I really apologize for this. I just got a warning to plug my computer in and I realized I don't have it right here. I will be right back. All right. Thank you for that. Apologies. So most of the time, you're just going to have to be worrying about business days. There might be calendar days used in a few of our addenda. Our commercial agreement makes greater use of calendar days. So the other thing to note about our document is that if you want to pick a pre-printed number of days for something, then you need to check that box. Okay. So we haven't set this up to say that, unless you've written something in, then it's 3 business days if it's left blank. Okay. We say, if you want 3 business days, check 3 business days. Okay. So always affirmatively check a box. We did that because we think it's important for you to have conversations with your client to ensure that they have the appropriate amount of time to do whatever it is that the contract is asking. Okay. So have those conversations and select that affirmatively. Okay. If you want something other than the pre-printed number, check here and you fill that in. The first time period provision that we have here is our earnest money deposit. Okay. And so what we've done here is obviously you could pick a number of days for the earnest money deposit, but what we really wanted to accomplish was creating more clarity around what happens when the earnest money is not deposited. Okay, and that's what the second half of this document does. So what we've done is laid out two options for a seller, okay? And I'll start with the second one, which is a little 2 here. If the buyer does not deposit the earnest money by the earnest money deposit deadline, within 2 business days after the end of the earnest money deposit deadline, the seller can terminate the transaction by delivering the Form 5.4 seller's notice of termination to the buyer, okay? And at that point, no more obligations are due from anybody, okay? The seller can move on, and the buyer can move on, and the buyer does not owe the earnest money that they didn't deposit. And if they had deposited a portion of that earnest money, they will get it back. Okay, this is the choice where people say, hey, we just want to move on, clean hands, everybody move on to the next thing. Okay, the other option is this little one. The seller can provide our Form 5.2 seller's notice of default to the buyer. That's a notice that is used to inform the other party when they're not complying with the term of the transaction, okay? We have a presentation that goes through our default notices and our termination notices. It's in that self-paced training library I showed you for CE credit. If you haven't taken it yet, take it. We're not gonna have time to go through all that here, but we have a notice called notice of default. You send it to the other side if they're not complying. Here, the seller can send that notice to the buyer saying, buyer, you did not deposit the earnest money by the deadline. I am giving you X number of days to do that. Okay, the pre-printed number in our document is 3 business days to do that. And if you don't do it by then I have a contractual right to terminate the agreement and to get that earnest money from you. So even though I have a right to terminate, I could file a small claim action or a mediation arbitration, depending on the amount of money, to actually get that money from you, okay? The seller's gonna have a legal right. They've given the buyer more time. The buyer's wasted more of their time. The seller's then gonna have a legal right for damages to actually go after that earnest money, okay? So those are the 2 options. Quick option, terminate, everybody moves on, or seller gives more time, but in giving more time, buyer has a bigger stake, and the buyer is going to be legally obligated to provide that, and the seller could file a legal claim to get it from them even after they've terminated. Okay. The second section here is on buyer representations and duties regarding financing. This is where the buyer is committing to act in good faith to pursue their loan. And one of the things that I want to point out to you here that might be a little bit different than what you're used to is that we have this section here that says that within 5 business days or blank business days, the buyer must provide the seller with evidence from the lender that buyer has submitted buyer's intent to proceed with the loan, okay? We wanted to have a concrete action for the buyer to take to demonstrate that they are in fact proceeding with their loan. Buyer receives a loan estimate from lender. Lender always follows up with the document saying, buyer, please indicate whether you want to move forward with the loan under the terms of the loan estimate I sent you. So there's always going to be some evidence that a buyer has said, yes, let's move forward with that loan that you provided me the estimate on. And so what we're asking here is that the buyer provide evidence of that to the seller so that the seller can be confident that the buyer is in fact pursuing their loan. Okay, so that might be an additional obligation, but we thought that was important. Another thing to point out is about when is the appraisal needing to be ordered. Well, to us, we thought the appraisal really should be ordered after the due diligence period. Okay, the due diligence period is the period in our contract where the buyer can investigate the property, similar to what you're used to seeing on the ORF agreement called the inspection period. Okay, it's really after that period, okay, where the buyer is no longer has the right to terminate based upon that contingency, that the parties are really fully committed to moving forward. And so that's when we thought it made sense to have a deadline for the buyer to order the appraisal. Now, if the parties want to pick a different date or amount of time for that, they can do that. They can check here and select a different number of days after mutual acceptance for the appraisal to be ordered. Okay. The next section I want to touch on is the financing contingency. And I see some questions, or I see some comments in the chat, but everyone be sure if you're asking questions, use the Q&A, please. Financing contingency. This is important. I want to talk about this. I see a question here. Let me see. If buyer never deposits earnest money, quick cash sale, closing, not extension, not signed, returned by buyer broker, title advises a termination doc to formally end the transaction, seller very damaged, hires well-known real estate attorney, is told that by completing the termination addendum, Seller cannot sue for the earnest money. Thoughts? Yeah, so again, take our class on terminations, but we've set up our termination documents very differently than the OREF ones. I don't know if this question here is about the OREF documents or ours. Our termination documents are one-way notices, and they're a little bit different. It's not a termination agreement, okay? And so it's a little bit different. So I think this question may be relating to the termination agreement under OREF. I'm not sure about Heidi. Feel free to reach out separately or take that terminations class and we can talk in more detail about that particular situation. Okay. So financing contingencies. So our financing contingency, it's similar to what you're used to seeing with the OREF document, but there are some differences. So I want to talk about that. Okay. If the parties, so first of all, the elements of the financing contingency. One, that buyer and the property have qualified for the agreed upon loan, okay? We say agreed upon loan because there's no contingency for the buyer if they choose a loan other than the one that they've contractually told the seller that they're going to get, okay? So they check a box on the first page, the type of loan, that's the loan that they have the contingency for, okay? Second, that the appraisal is equal to or greater than the purchase price, okay? Now here, the parties can select the number of days after buyer receives notice from lender of a failure of their financing contingency to notify the seller, okay? And it may be that the buyer needs a couple of days or more to figure out their situation so that they can, when they enter a renegotiation with the seller to try to keep the deal alive, if that's what they want to do, that they've had time to sort of get their finances organized, okay? So we give you an option here for how much time you get before having to notify the seller, okay? Then once the seller is notified, two things can happen. The buyer can terminate at the same time they notify the seller that the financing contingencies failed, okay? And they would send our one-way buyer termination notice to the seller. Okay, alternatively, they can enter renegotiation with the seller, okay? And here you have a period of time to indicate a renegotiation period, okay? 2 business days pre-printed or print your own number of days, okay? If the parties renegotiate, then they're going to sign an addendum that is detailing the details of the new terms of the deal based on their renegotiation. If they don't reach an agreement, though, then within 2 business days after the end of the failed financing renegotiation period, one or the other of those parties needs to terminate the transaction by sending a termination notice. We do not have automatic terminations in our residential purchase and sale agreement, okay? So you cannot be relying on something to automatically terminate. Here, if the parties fail to renegotiate, one side or the other within 2 business days after the end of that renegotiation period needs to send our termination notice, and that will affirmatively end the deal. If that happens, the buyer's going to have a right to get their earnest money back because the deal died because of a failure of the financing contingency. However, if nobody sends a termination notice, okay, then our contract presumes that the parties want to move forward without the financing contingency, okay? So buyers need to know, just always send that termination notice if you're unable to come to a renegotiation. Okay. Heidi. All right, proof of funds for cash purchases. I don't want to go into depth here. I'll let you read this. Buyer has to provide proof of funds. Those proof of funds have to be reasonably satisfactory to the seller. There's no perfect standard for this of what is satisfactory. So we use a general legal thing, which is that it has to be reasonably satisfactory, satisfactory to a reasonable person in the seller's position. That is that. So I don't think there's a lot to talk about with relation to the proof of funds section. This next section is our due diligence contingency. Okay, this is really important. I want to spend some time on it. This is our primary investigation period for the buyer to determine if this property meets their needs. Okay, it is a broader right than what is included in the OREF agreement. Okay. Ours is called the due diligence contingency. We instruct the buyer to do all due diligence on the property, and the buyer can terminate if the property does not meet their needs during this due diligence period. The termination does not have to be based upon a professional inspection report, okay? So we do say here that if the buyer is going to have the property inspected, it needs to be inspected by licensed professionals, okay? And the buyer should have the property inspected. But let's take a scenario where, for example, it's the day after the sale agreement, or maybe the afternoon that the sale agreement was signed, and the buyer goes down to the county to investigate the approved uses for the property, and they had wanted to use it for a short-term rental, or they had wanted to build an ADU on the property, and those things cannot be done. The buyer could terminate without ever having ordered an inspection report, because they now know this property does not meet their needs, okay? So in that sense, it's a broader right. It's also a broader right than the inspection period under the OREF agreement, because we have defined several items as being non-invasive inspections for the purposes of this agreement, okay? So we say that sewer scopes, mold tests, pest inspections, dry rot inspections, radon tests, and locating an oil tank, those are all things that a buyer can do without getting additional written approval from the seller, okay? Now, any other inspection that would be considered an invasive inspection would need separate written approval, but we have defined these items for the purpose of this agreement as not being invasive inspections so that the buyer can do them without additional approval from seller, okay? We have included here a period of time. 10 business days is the pre-written number, okay? So that's going to be similar for those of you who are used to using the OREF agreement, but you can also write in your own number of days. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out about this section that I think is important to highlight, because I know this is an issue that there's a lot of discussion about, is what happens when a buyer sends an inspection report to a seller and the seller has not requested that inspection report. Okay. So our agreement does not prohibit a buyer from doing that. Okay, so I'll say that again. A buyer under our agreement is not prohibited from sending an inspection report to a seller if the seller hasn't requested it, okay? On the other hand, if the seller has requested the inspection report, our contract requires the buyer to provide it to the seller, okay? And that requirement lasts for up to 10 business days after termination, okay? So if the deal falls apart because of the due diligence contingency, up to 10 business days after termination, if the seller says, hey, I want to see that report, then the buyer will need to send that report to the seller. All right. The next section I want to talk about is the title contingency and reports section, okay? So our agreement says that within 1 business day of mutual acceptance that the title report will be ordered, okay? And then we have a series of timelines related to the buyer disapproving of an item in the title report and the seller correcting that item so that the buyer is satisfied to move forward, okay? So 5 business days after the delivery of the preliminary title report and title documents, the buyer will have to raise an objection to items in that document, okay? And they need to do that in writing. That is their title review period. And if they do that, the seller then is going to have 5 or however many you put in business days to either correct those items or to provide reasonable assurances to buyer that they will be corrected by closing. Another thing to highlight here is what happens if there's an additional amended title report that's issued that has new material information in it. What our contract says there is that if a new amended title report is issued after the first one was issued, and it has additional liens, CC&Rs, deed restrictions, or encumbrances, then a buyer is going to get an additional 5 business day period to raise any written objections to those new items only. They cannot raise an objection to an item from the previous report, only to items that are new in that additional amended report that was provided, okay? I see there's some questions here. For clarity, if no termination notice is sent within 2 business days, technically it's automatically assumed that the parties are all in agreement. If negotiations are still happening, one party should send an addendum to extend the timeline. Yes, that is correct. Anytime in our document where it says, hey, if one party needs to send a termination notice within X number of business days of something else, and here you're talking about the financing renegotiation period, if the parties want to get more time to renegotiate, they should extend the financing renegotiation period by addendum, okay? Next question. Some large properties are complex. Can you repeat what you said about invasive inspections? What is an example of non-allowed? For example, home automation system that is very complex. Okay, the invasive inspections that are allowed are sewer scopes, mold tests, pest inspections, dry rot inspections, radon tests, and locating an oil tank. Okay, in terms of what defines an invasive inspection, there is no standard definition. Okay, there's no, you can't look up in the dictionary somewhere and learn exactly what an invasive inspection is for the purposes of a real estate contract. So it's going to be based upon reasonable interpretations and industry practices. Unfortunately, there's nowhere we can point you to state particularly what is an invasive inspections. People have to use their best judgment about what a reasonable person in this industry would consider an invasive inspection. Sorry that I can't give you a better answer on that. All right. So we're back on the title report section. So I mentioned if there's a new report with new items, there can be a new objection to that report and a new timeline. Okay, here we've laid out what happens if that new report comes in and there are objections and you're bumping up against the closing date. So this, I won't go in through detail, but we have a section here that deals with that. Okay, so there may be an automatic extension of the closing date if that time is needed for the seller to be able to correct those items that were raised in that buyer's objection if that amended report had came within 5 business days of closing. Okay, so that there's time to get that done. The next section is, so this is the last section in our document, actually right here, where you're going to be checking a box on anything. Okay, from here on out, this is all pre-printed. We do not have anything for you to write other than on the last page where you're going to be putting the offer deadline and the parties are going to be signing. This next section, though, is still a time period term because there's a deadline. It's about the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Prior to buyer's appraisal, or if no appraisal is conducted at least 5 business days before closing, seller needs to install working smoke detectors and a required number of smoke alarm CO detectors. Okay, what we say here at the bottom is that if those were not installed before the appraisal and there has to be a reinspection because the appraiser or the lender needs to reinspect because they don't have evidence of working smoke and CO detectors, then the seller is going to be on the hook for that cost of reinspection because it was the seller's fault that that reinspection was needed. This next section is on risk of loss. This explains what happens if all or a material part of the property is destroyed during the pendency of the transaction. There is an underlying Oregon law that deals with this issue, okay? And what it says is that if neither closing nor possession have occurred and all or a material part of the property is destroyed, then buyer is not obligated to purchase the property and they can receive a refund of all earnest money and deposits that they have submitted. However, if all or material part of the property is destroyed and buyer has either closed or taken possession, then buyer is still obligated to purchase the property. So we have reflected that underlying statute in this section. That is the baseline terms that we have provided here. However, we've also provided a process for when buyer wants to move forward with the transaction, okay? Because it may be that the damage can be repaired, the buyer still wants the home, and in that case, we're requiring that seller diligently pursue their insurance claims, and we're providing a up to 60 calendar day automatic extension of the closing date for that property to get repaired. Okay, so the buyer is going to have some choice in this situation. They can terminate, get everything back, have no obligation, or they can choose to stick it out and still try to buy that property. And in that case, the seller is going to be obligated to pursue those repairs. Of course, if you get to the end of that new closing date that's set and the seller hasn't been able to complete the repairs, the buyer is going to be able to terminate and keep earnest money unless you all have created some addendum that says otherwise. Okay. The next section of our document is on the lead-based paint and lead-based hazards. We have a training in that final video library I showed you on lead-based paint. And so I encourage you to take that. Our lead-based paint provisions are a little bit different than the OREF ones. We call ours lead hazard contingency, first of all, to capture both lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards, which are described under federal law. But then the mechanics that we've set up are a little bit different than with OREF, okay? So first off, something I want to point out to you all is that you always should be, the seller should be providing these documents both our Form 2.6, which is the disclosure document, and the Form 10.3, which is the EPA pamphlet, to the buyer before the buyer and seller have finally agreed on the purchase agreement. Okay, that's the ideal scenario. That's what the EPA really wants to see. They want to see that a buyer was able to take into account that information before the parties finalize the deal. Because if the buyer learns about lead-based paint or hazards, they may not want to buy, or they may want to offer less money or something. Okay, so that's the ideal scenario. That's really what should be happening. Okay, we would recommend to make that happen is that, hey, if you receive an offer from a buyer, it's going to take some time for the seller to evaluate that offer, right? So as soon as when you get that offer, reply, thanks for your offer. By the way, here are the lead-based hazard documents. Okay, send them over. It's going to take some time for your seller to review and evaluate that offer. If the buyer sees those documents and decides they don't want to buy that house, or they want to change their offer, they can send over a indication that they're withdrawing their offer. Okay, so that would be sufficient, because we know you don't know who's going to offer on your house. So sometimes it might be hard to get these documents to them before they make their offer. But if you do what I just described, you should be in good shape. Okay. We also, though, have provisions to deal with what happens if seller does not provide these documents before, because we want to ensure that everyone's still complying with federal law. Now it's 11 o'clock. If it's okay with y'all, I'm going to go for 15 more minutes to finish this presentation. If y'all need to leave, feel free to do so, because we don't want to waste your time, and we'll make sure you still get your CE credit. But if you can stick around for 15 minutes, I'll finish up. So we want to be sure that the parties are complying with federal law, and federal law says that the seller needs to provide the documents before the buyer is obligated to purchase. Okay, so what we've done in our contract is say here at the bottom, if seller is required under this section to provide the pamphlet and the disclosures to the buyer, and they fail to do so, the buyer can terminate up until closing. Okay, so if the buyer never receives the documents, now they have a right to terminate up till closing. It's more like the seller property disclosure statement rule. So we built that in here because we want to be able to say that the buyer was not obligated to purchase. And you may think, well, wow, that's really generous to the buyer, but really it's generous to the seller. We're protecting the seller from violating federal law and getting slapped with an $11,000 fine because they didn't provide these documents to the buyer before the buyer was obligated to purchase. So we're trying to create an out for a buyer here so that they are not obligated to purchase. Okay. Secondly, but again, the best thing and what should be happening is the seller providing these to buyer before there's ever been a sale agreement entered into. Okay. Secondarily, in the lead-based hazard addendum document, disclosure document, we say, buyer, if you received this document after mutual acceptance, you have a 2 business day right to terminate for any reason. Okay. Again, the purpose being that in that case, if it was provided after mutual acceptance, we still want to be able to show that the buyer was not obligated to purchase. And by giving the buyer the right to unilaterally terminate unconditionally, then the buyer was not obligated to purchase. So that is why it's set up this way. Okay, so if you're used to the ORAP, where there's more of just this 10-day blanket opportunity to terminate or do the inspection for lead-based paint, ours is a bit different. Of course, our addendum also has the disclosures and then the opportunity for the buyer to select if they want to do the 10 calendar day inspection or some other number of days inspections for lead paint. And of course, the buyer would be able to terminate based on that inspection as well, should they do that inspection. But these are just sort of preliminary rights to terminate that I'm describing to you in the instance that buyer either never receives the lead paint documents or they receive them after mutual acceptance. Okay. Now, the next section is the seller property disclosure statement. You all know this law, hopefully well, because you practice real estate in Oregon. This just describes it to the parties, what the seller's obligation is, what the buyer's rights are. Okay. This next section is really a reminder to the parties about what was on the first page, that, hey, if this is new construction or if there is 50,000 in remodeling, then you need to use our Form 4.1. We added it here too, because maybe the fact is you don't know when you enter the contract that there's going to be 50,000 in remodeling. There ends up being 50,000 in remodeling. We still want there to be this obligation here to provide the new construction addendum and fill that out so that the buyer is protected against construction liens and the seller is complying with the Oregon Homebuyer Protection Act. Okay, so that is the time period terms. We're through with those. Now we're on to our general terms. And again, this is the part of the contract where you really shouldn't be modifying it, and we have not provided space for you to modify it. So we start with our definitions. You can read these definitions on your own time. The one I want to point out to you is the business day definition. We say a business day is any day other than Saturday, Sunday, or a legal state holiday under ORS 187.010. If y'all will indulge me here, I'm going to open up a new tab and I'm going to Google ORS 187.010. What am I going to see? I'm going to see the statute from the legislature right there. I'm going to click on that and I'm going to scroll down past these headings. And the first thing I'm going to see is the first statute, 187.010, legal holidays, describes them right there. Okay. You all now have a place to go in statute to know precisely what is a holiday and therefore not a business day. Okay. If anything ever changes on that, we'll inform you. Okay. I know that there had been changes to some holidays in the last couple of years, but that's really rare. We don't expect that to keep happening. But if it ever did, we would notify you of that, hey, there's been a change to that statutory list. But we wanted to give you a place to go so that you always could definitively determine whether it's a business day or a holiday. Okay. The one day that's going to be different between our agreements, the ORF agreement and ours on that front, is Columbus Day, because Columbus Day is a federal holiday. It's not an Oregon legal holiday. And the ORF agreement points to federally recognized holidays. And Indigenous Peoples Day is recognized in Oregon, but it's not an official legal holiday where the state's closed. So it did not make it onto that statutory list. And we're going by that statutory list. So that day that's Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day is going to be a business day under our agreement. Okay. The next point I want to point out, if your party's doing a 1031 exchange, they need to promptly disclose that. So promptly under our agreement is defined. It means as soon as practicable and never more than 2 business days, meaning you're doing it as soon as you practically can do it, but you're never going to take more than 2 business days. Okay. And so that needs to happen. That obligation doesn't kick in until there's an agreement, right? You're not obligated by this provision until you've actually agreed to it. So you don't have to disclose that it's a 1031 exchange beforehand. We did not create it as a checkbox on the offer, for example, because we don't want people making decisions about whether to enter the sale agreement or not based on that. But once there's been an agreement, it's important for the other side to know that they're going to be part of a 1031 exchange. And we say they must cooperate here unless for some reason cooperation adds cost or liability to the non-exchanging party. Okay. Here, this is really important. A lot of people think that the only place where sellers are representing things about the condition of the property, any defects in the property, is in the seller property disclosure statement. But that's not true. Before there even was a statute for the seller property disclosure statement, which I think was adopted in like 93, as part of a wave across the US of putting in statute these disclosure statements, most real estate contracts already required seller to disclose defects related to the property and other condition information about the property. And the common law, meaning just judge-made law, okay, over the years of property law in Oregon, also requires that a seller disclose any material defects related to the property. Okay, so this part of the contract is really important, where the seller is representing facts about the property and they're required to disclose if anything here is not true or if there are any material defects related to the property. So the seller needs to read this carefully, and if they cannot agree to all of these statements and they're not all accurate, the seller needs to counteroffer with an addendum explaining what's not true in here and making those disclosures, okay? Because here they're representing that all of these statements are true. Even if a seller is not obligated to do a seller property disclosure statement under statute, they are still obligated to make these representations in the contract. And they are still obligated under common law to disclose any material defects. So don't think that just because your seller didn't have to provide a property disclosure statement, if that's the case, that they don't have to represent information about the condition of the property. The other thing is that this is an ongoing obligation. Down here, if the seller learns of information during the pendency of the transaction that makes any of these statements inaccurate, they need to provide that information to the buyer, okay? Now, because the buyer had the benefit of all of these disclosures from the seller, and because the buyer had the benefit of a due diligence period where they got to investigate the property and even terminate if they had wanted to. Once they do buy the property, they are buying it as is, where is. Okay. At that point, it's really buyer beware. Okay. The only instance where a buyer is going to have a recourse because they don't like something that they learn after the fact about that property is if the seller had made an intentional or reckless misrepresentation to them, okay, about the property. And in some cases, maybe a negligent misrepresentation, okay, but they're not going to be able to get damages if that's the case. But so essentially, unless the seller said something that wasn't truthful, buyer is stuck with that property. They're on the hook. They should have known what was going on with that property. All right. Now, this next section is the FIRPTA section. I mentioned before that if the seller is a foreign person under FIRPTA, you need to use our FIRPTA addendum because it's going to go into more detail about buyers withholding obligations because the seller is a foreign person under FIRPTA. Now, in most cases, the seller is not a foreign person under FIRPTA. And in most cases, then the instructions are relatively simple about working with escrow to get the certification of non-foreign status and the qualified substitute statement. That's what this section explains and tells the parties to go work with the escrow company on that. Okay. The next section is about proration of taxes, fees, utilities, rents, and deposits. So here we have laid out what would be a typical allocation of taxes, fees, utilities, rents, and deposits. And on the first page of the document, you were able to indicate the transition point for these prorations. Is it closing? Is it possession, or some other date? That was on the first page. Okay, I mentioned that you really shouldn't be editing this or modifying this part of the document in the general terms. This is one section where, hey, if the parties read this and they say, actually, we want to allocate rents and deposits differently than this, then that could be a place where you would use a general addendum to modify it. Okay. One of the few places in this last section where you might be modifying something. Same thing with closing costs. We've laid out what a typical allocation is. Okay, on the first page, you already had indicated whether seller was picking up any of those closing costs for buyer. But here we're just laying out what the obligation is, closing costs between buyer, which closing costs are going to be paid by buyer and which are going to be paid by seller. If the seller is contributing to the buyer's closing costs, great. You already covered that on the first page. But if you need to change the breakdown here, then you could use an addendum to do that. This next section is on closing and possession. What are the obligations around closing, delivering of the property, condition of the property, cleaning, etc. Okay. So we say, first of all, that closing shall occur on the date identified on page 1, where you check closing date, or by 5 p.m., okay, on that date, or on an earlier date if the parties agree. Okay, so if you all pick the date for closing and you say, hey, we can actually get this done 5 days earlier, great. Agree in writing on that and do it 5 days earlier. In terms of the time of closing, it doesn't matter as long as it happens by 5 p.m. on the closing date. Okay, so if escrow company and title company can schedule you in at noon and instead of at 4 or at 3, that's great. We didn't put a time for closing on the first page because that's not something you're actually going to predict 45 days or 60 days in advance. We put the date and it has to happen by 5 p.m. on that date. Okay. In terms of the condition, the seller's got to deliver the property to buyer in the substantially the same condition it was in prior or at the time of buyer's offer. Why? Because that's what buyer offered on. Buyer made their decision about how much to offer and the terms based upon the condition of the property at that time. Seller needs to keep it in that condition. Also, seller needs to clean and remove all trash and debris. Some people ask us, why did we not define clean more? Because it's really impossible to define clean in a precise way. Everyone, no matter what words you use, some people say broom clean, it's not any more precise. It's got to be clean. Trash and debris has to be removed. And we didn't think that adding extra words was going to help with that situation. Okay. Now, we do say in much more detail here, though, what happens when a seller leaves personal property that wasn't part of the sale agreement. Okay. Well, we say that a seller gives up all rights to that property. So if a seller leaves something that's personal property at closing, they're not going to have any rights to it. Okay. That means the buyer can keep it, the buyer can sell it, the buyer can get rid of it, whatever the buyer wants to do. We also state that if the buyer has to expend resources in getting rid of that property, they got to call 1-800-GOT-JUNK. Then the seller is legally obligated to the buyer for those damages. Okay, so the buyer could bring a small claim or mediation arbitration, depending on the amount. and they could recover those costs from the seller. Okay. Now, the one exception that I just want to say here, it's very rare, but there's a federal law called the Visual Artists' Rights Act. If there is artwork left on the property that is like a mural, for example, or some custom piece of art, there could be a situation where the artist has rights in that independent of the seller. Okay, so if a buyer inherits that from a seller because the seller left it, buyer should maybe talk with an attorney, check into that first before they do anything with that artwork, because they want to make sure that the artist doesn't have any rights in it. Okay. We say statutory warranty deed is how the property will be transferred. That's the highest quality deed. Don't change that. If it's a bargain and sale deed or some lesser quality deed, have your parties talk to an attorney before they agree to do a transfer with a lesser quality deed. This next section, we describe default under our agreement. I'm not going to go into detail here, because to really get the level of detail you need, you should take our class on defaults and terminations under the Oregon Realtor Sale Agreement. It's called Death of a Transaction. It's a CE credit class. I showed it to you earlier in the self-paced forms library. Okay, so just know here there's a section that describes when a party's in default under our agreement, and you should read that section, and you should take our class on defaults. Same thing with terminations. That class I told you about describes in detail how terminations work under our agreement. Okay, but we do have a section here as well that describes it. Okay, so read the section and take that class to really get the full treatment that you need on terminations. Okay, earnest money disposition. Again, that's mostly going to be handled in the details on the defaults and the terminations. In many cases, the agreement itself is going to state who gets the earnest money, and our termination document is even organized by who gets the earnest money based on the type of termination that's being selected. So we've tried to do a really good job of using the contract itself to explain to you sort of who gets the earnest money if a termination occurs for a particular reason. Okay. Dispute resolution. This is how the seller and buyer are going to resolve disputes if they arise under the agreement. We say everything within the jurisdiction of small claims goes to small claims court in the county where the property is located. Okay, that means $10,000 or less in a monetary dispute goes to small claims. If it is more than $10,000, or it's not a monetary dispute because it's like a specific performance claim or some other claim that's not monetary, then that's going to go to mediation and arbitration. That mediation is going to be filed at Arbitration Services of Portland. And if the parties are not able to successfully mediate, they will arbitrate at Arbitration Services of Portland. The one exception to this is if you are a PMAR member, or if either of the agents is a PMAR member, then their client instead would initiate the mediation at PMAR, because PMAR has a mediation program for buyers and sellers, but it's the only local association in the state that does. So we just specified, hey, if agent is a PMAR member on either side, then the party should file the mediation at PMAR to take advantage of that program that's available, and a good program. Okay. Then from here on out, we have a lot of kind of baseline legal provisions here. The Oregon law requires there to be a provision notifying the parties regarding fire protection districts and approved uses. This is the language from the Oregon statute on that. We talk about assignment. This contract cannot be assigned by the buyer to someone else, to a third party, unless the seller is given permission. That permission could come either if the seller wrote in the buyer's name and or assigns, and if the seller agreed to that, then they would have known and already agreed to it, or there could be an addendum to the contract or some other writing where the seller is agreeing to allow the buyer to assign. Okay, the obligations do survive death, meaning the heirs and estates of these parties are still going to be obligated. Okay, and that's similar to the provision in the OREF document. Time is of the essence. That means that the deadlines in this document are meaningful. They're material. Okay, if you don't meet them, then you are not meeting a material provision of this agreement. So that informs the parties that you have to take those very seriously. Severability, meaning that if for some reason there was a dispute over this contract or the validity of portions of this contract, the portions that are struck because they weren't valid would be reconstrued to accomplish the same objective as closely as possible while still being in compliance with law. And also all the other provisions of the agreement that were not struck would still be in effect. Okay, so that's a common provision in a contract. We have included it here. Non-waiver, that means that because a party had sort of allowed another party to sort of get away with something that otherwise would have been a default or a breach of this agreement does not mean that they are in the future authorizing that to happen again or authorizing any other defaults or breaches under this agreement. Okay. The entire agreement not means, hey, look, this is the whole agreement. What you talked about beforehand, what you put in the MLS, that does not count. It's what's in here. If you want to change it, you need to do it in writing in an addendum to this agreement. Counterparts means if for some reason your two parties can't sign the same document, you can't send it to one person for a DocuSign and then another. They're out of the country. They don't have access to the same electronic technology. If they sign the same contract, a contract with the same exact provisions in it, but there are two versions of it because they couldn't sign the same exact version, then it's still going to be a contract. It's still going to be binding. Okay. Now, this is the part where you're going to fill things in again. Okay. The buyer is going to put an offer expiration date and time here, and they're going to sign and date the document. Okay. And then the seller is going to either accept, reject, or counter. Counter offer is form 2.1. They're also going to sign and date. Unless they have checked accepts and signed and dated, it will not be a contract. Okay, it will not be a valid contract. They have to both check accepts and sign and date. We didn't want there to be any ambiguity about that, so you have to check that box. If the seller is trying to accept the buyer's offer, but it's after the expiration date up here in the buyer's offer deadline, then the seller needs to use our form 2.3. That is a document that's called the late acceptance document. Seller would sign and accept this offer here. Okay, they would sign that late acceptance addendum. They would send both back to the buyer. That buyer is now in the position to decide if they want to move forward. They could ratify the contract by signing the late acceptance addendum, and then there is a contract. Okay, or they can say, no, you didn't meet it by my deadline. I don't want to move forward, and I don't have to. Okay, and then they don't sign the late acceptance addendum, where they reject it, and there's no contract. Here is where the agent is going to indicate they have presented the offer to the seller, and this evidence of that here will be helpful to you for your files because that's something you need to keep for your files in case you get audited. All right, so that is the sale agreement. Last thing I'll note, page 10, this agreement is not an earnest money receipt. Okay, if you're used to handling earnest money, you'll need a separate receipt for that. Earnest money receipt by Oregon regulation has to state whether the earnest money was delivered by check, promissory note, or cash. We don't have that provision in our agreement. We're presuming in most cases, buyer's going to deposit earnest money directly with escrow as an electronic transfer. And we don't want this to be as an earnest money receipt. We don't want to be talking about promissory notes. So you'll need a separate receipt if you're doing collecting earnest money directly. And then let's see, there was some questions. That is the end of the agreement. Is it possible to have important deadlines populate into a separate document to help buyer and seller stay on top? Lisa, great question. This is one of the things I want to talk to the vendors about to see if that's possible. For it to happen automatically, that would mean the program like a Zip and a SkySlope would need to be able to be intelligent enough to know our rules for what is and isn't a business day, for example. I don't know if that's the case, but even if that's not the case, we could create an addendum document that would allow you as the agent to write those things in to have as a cheat sheet. But that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out and work on. I appreciate that question. It'd be great if that's something that could happen automatically. All right, I'm gonna stop my share. Thank you, everybody. Is there any more questions? I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes if there are any additional questions. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody. Feel free to pop off. I'll just hang out for a couple minutes in case anyone wants to stick around and chat or ask additional questions. All right, I see some, I'll just do this while, if anyone's still on. I do see some questions that did go into the chat instead of the Q&A. Can you put the lead paint disclosure and pamphlet on the MLS when that count is getting it to the buyer? So putting it on the MLS is a good idea in the sense that it puts the buyer unaware that it exists, but it is not sufficient for delivery. So I would say, yeah, put it on the MLS so that everyone knows it's there and that it exists, but you'd still need to separately deliver it because just posting on MLS would not count as delivery. At the end, can you show us again how to get the document that has the video clips? Absolutely. Let me share my screen and show you that for those who are still here. All right, so this is our forms website. Take you back to the home page. So you start where you'll be starting if you're going. Here's the home page. If you go to training, then training, you're going to scroll down. And at the bottom of the training page, if you scroll, that's where you're going to find the documents that have the guided videos along with the forms. And just as a reminder of all the other stuff that's available here, self-paced trainings, these are going to be your CE credit, full-length CE credit version trainings, live trainings and webinars. That's what you did today. We do those every Friday. Virtual open house is our 11 a.m. place to just drop in and ask questions. And recorded tutorials are a series of videos on our YouTube channel, oftentimes a bit shorter, not for CE credit, but still very helpful information. Also, if anyone wants to become an instructor on our forums, you can fill out an interest form to do that here. All right, thanks everyone. I'm not seeing any more questions pop in, so I think we will hop off. Thanks so much.